A very we have two very sorry about the feedback that's coming in, but these are just birthing pangs, I guess. Um, we have two very powerful women in conversation today in publishing, and they're talking about what is not getting published, or rather, what's getting out of print. This is a session we have all been looking forward to quite a lot, and just a small disclaimer, Kanishka Gupta, the famous literary agent, was also supposed to join us, but due to a family emergency, he would not be able to join in today. So we have Alexandra Pringle, the editor-in-chief from Bloomsbury Group, in conversation with Karthika VK, publisher and head of Amazon Westland Publishing. And what they are talking about today is out of print, what's plaguing publishing. Off to you, Karthika.
Not being here, we actually thought again about what we might do. And we thought maybe it's an interesting idea to talk through. Alexandra has been in all sorts of places as part of the publishing life. She's been, as she just told me, an agent among publisher roles in various publishing houses, starting with Virago. So, Alexandra, let's start talking about how publishing changed, evolved, came to be what it is now, in a form that feels fairly mature and sort of whole somehow. And I can't really see any dramatic changes that have happened in the last few years. What happened has happened, I guess, in the last few decades. And a lot happened then, from independent presses to the big five that we have now, and big five might soon be big four. So will you tell us what it's been like, this journey for you?
I'd be delighted to. And first of all, I'd like to say I'm so happy to be in Calcutta, even if not in person. I wish I were there in person, but it's lovely to be part of this wonderful festival. Yes, my publishing has been very various, and in a way in some ways has followed the fortunes of publishing in the larger world. when I joined publishing, which was in the late 1970s, and I was in my 20s, my early 20s, it was a completely different creature than it is now. And it seems like really a far off land. When I joined Virago, it had just begun. I was literally the fourth person to join the company, and it was in this tiny office in Soho, in a rather seamy district of London, where there were lots of sex shops and pinball arcades and drinking clubs, and our office was up many, many flights of stairs, and we all worked together in one room, and we only had, I think, 2 or 3 typewriters, and they were typewriters then. There were no computers. You had to parcel up all your manuscripts and send them off. You had to, do everything manually. It was a completely different world. I mean, it now looks almost Dickensian, I think, looking back on it from where we are here. And of course, it was a much slower world too. And it was a more radical world. So Virago was founded really to change the world, to change the position of women in the world. And it was one of 2 feminist presses in the UK. But the founder of Virago, Carmen Khalil, also wanted it to be a financial success, because she knew that power came with commerce, that the two were interlinked. But it was incredibly radical, and we published books about women's lives all over the world, and including, I think, one of the most exciting books we published back then, which was very radical, which was a book about Indian women's lives in Britain and what they were like. And it was absolutely exhausted all the time, doing all the most horrible jobs. But I learned.
How old were you then?
I was 24 when I joined.
Okay. Enough energy to do all of that.
Yes. No, I was 24, 25. Yeah, I had plenty of energy, but wore very unsuitable clothes. I refused to sign up. I was absolutely a through and through feminist, but I insisted on wearing heels and makeup. And I used to have to take the post to the post office, staggering along in the wrong clothes. But I learned everything there, and I grew from being the office assistant to being the editor of the Virago Modern Classics series, and then publishing new books. And when I was 30, I became editorial director, and was part of the management team that went into a little group which was Jonathan Cape and Bodley Head and Chatto and Windus, which was called CBC. And then we bought ourselves out a few years later to become independent again. So
that's really interesting. So can you dwell a little bit on that? I mean, why would you do that?
So we realized within about a year that because we had to take on the overheads of the larger company, our profitability was being damaged, and we always made a 10% profit. And we did really extremely well in our small way. But once we were part of the bigger group, we lost our profitability, and we also lost power. We lost power to do what we wanted, and we wanted to reclaim that power. So the management team of 5 started to negotiate. And just as we did the deal, it took a year to do the deal, was when Random House bought Cape, Chatto and Bodley Head. And that was really the beginning of the explosion, the growth of these big corporations. And we witnessed it with our own eyes. They wanted us to stay there, and we refused, and we went independent. But our independence didn't last. It went on for a few years. Later, I left and went to Hamish Hamilton. So I joined a big group. I joined the Penguin Group, and I joined Corporate Life. But Virago was later bought by Little Brown and has been part of that for some time. So it's no longer the little fiery independent press that it started as, and it was when I was there.
What do you think happened? I mean, is it because as a publishing house with a particular agenda, was it harder to do more commercial books that would lead to higher profitability, or were there other reasons why staying independent was so hard?
I think that I think various things happened. The retail trade changed, and the end of the net book agreement was a terrible blow because the prices of books were suddenly discounted, and of course they hadn't been until then. There were all sorts of shifts in the publishing landscape, and the shifts were towards these big groups that had more power, and it made it much harder for smaller publishers to exist. Tiny publishers have always been able to exist, and they, I think, are the beacon of hope nowadays, you know, the really tiny ones, because they nurture the talent. But those sort of medium-sized, ambitious publishers, commercially ambitious publishers, had a harder and harder time of it.
Correct, yeah. You know, the agreement you spoke about how that changed things. I'm not sure that Indian viewers at some point watching this would really know what you're talking about. Okay. So do you think you could spend some time?
The net book agreement was an agreement. It was law that all books had to be published at the same price. So there couldn't be discounting on books. And it's like that in Germany. You know, there are countries still that have that. So it doesn't matter what retail outlet you go to, you pay the same price for a book. And that favors smaller publishers, whereas larger publishers can try and shift large quantities at very cheap prices. And of course, also it favored literary publishers. And I've always been on the literary side rather than the commercial side of publishing. So I've seen the effect that what's called the mid-list, I hate that expression so much, you know, the poor mid-list, but really, frankly, the books I love, which are all about the writing, those are the ones that are the hardest to publish, and they're the ones that suffer the most because you cannot publish, you know, you can't shift hundreds of thousands of copies. You're looking at it's like hand publishing in a way. It's like bespoke tailoring rather than mass market.
Yeah. So then after, you think that had something to do with the independent presses at that time having trouble coping, the smaller presses, etc. Was that something that happened across? Was it just Virago that felt who were the others?
Well, there were other small presses. I mean, there was the other feminist press, the women's press, which went out completely. But, you know, a lot of them just got bought up. So what was happening in the publishing landscape is the small literary imprints like Jonathan Cape and Chatto were being bought up. So when I joined Penguin at the end of the 80s, I joined Hamish Hamilton. Hamish Hamilton had been a small publisher, been that very distinguished imprint, publisher at Hamish Hamilton, which then became an imprint of Penguin Pearson, yes. And the same Michael Joseph was also bought up by them. Viking was the only imprint that was started with it, the only hardback imprint that was started within Penguin. So really, there were very, very few independent publishers left that hadn't been, you know, bought up by a larger group. And that's just gone on and on and on. So until we get to the big five.
So did you see your own work changing when you went from Virago to a larger publishing house? Like, did you acquire differently? Did you read differently?
Well, first of all, I started acquiring men because at Virago we didn't publish any men.
Good for you.
That was quite exciting. But it was when I encountered a different world of publishing, which is when you started to have to think about what is the market for the book, what do our salespeople think. At Virago, it was completely editorially driven, really. All the decisions were made by the editors. But when it came to being part of the Penguin Group, the decisions were made increasingly they were group decisions, you know, made by marketing, publicity, sales, and so forth. But also, when I was at Penguin, the hardback imprints had to get a partner on the paperback side in order to buy a book.
Okay.
And if you couldn't find, it's like dating. If you couldn't find a date,
right, you couldn't acquire it.
No. And it was a real problem for me because my literary taste wasn't very well aligned with the editors there. And for example, a first novel that I wanted to buy when I joined the company, which I did end up buying, but it was a huge fight, was Esther Freud's novel, Hideous Kinky, that was then made into that lovely film with Kate Winslet.
Yeah.
And about her experience of being a little girl in Marrakesh. And my mother's family come from Morocco, so I had a interest in Morocco. Loved the book, but I couldn't get any editors to pair with me. And I remember having a tremendous row with my boss, who is the amazing Andrew Franklin. Now runs Profile Books. And he was so good to me over that, because in the end he said, okay, we'll buy it and we'll sell the paperback rights outside of Penguin. After the hardback comes out. And we published it, and it was a huge success, and she was chosen by Granta as a Best of Young British Writer, along with Ian McEwan and Ishiguro and Jeanette Winterson and so on. And the really funny thing was, we auctioned the paperback rights, and guess what? Penguin bought them.
Which imprint was that?
It was Penguin paperbacks. So
Penguin paperbacks, right?
Because it had been such a success, they didn't want the book to go outside of the Penguin group.
So why did you take it through the auction route then? Why not have internally already just put it out?
We didn't even discuss it with them because they had rejected it.
Now that's power, real power.
I think, you know, in the end, as a publisher, as an editor, all you have is your own taste. And this is, you know, I don't know how you find it, that, you know, there's always this, you know, this tension between what people see as the marketplace and what an editor feels really in their heart and in their, you know, in their skin about a book. And it's very important for as much as possible, I think, for publishers, editors and all the different departments to work in concert, because that way you can do the best by an author and the best by a book. And you know, if an editor buys a book that other people don't support and don't understand how to publish, or don't often quite rightly feel will not work commercially, then you're not doing the right thing by the author. But every now and again, and this is one of the lovely things about Nigel Newton, our CEO, is that, you know, he will say, sometimes as an editor, you just have to follow your heart. And I remember doing that with Elizabeth Gilbert's Eat, Pray, Love.
Oh, right.
Nobody saw it, nobody. And it was the only people who loved that book were me and my then assistant, who was Chiki Saka.
All right.
Right. And we both absolutely loved it, and we didn't have to buy it for much because no other British publisher wanted it. And so we published it, but it took 4 years because the press weren't interested, the bookshops weren't interested, and you know, it just took a long time, and we ended up selling 2.5 million copies.
Fantastic.
So, you know, as you know, Karthika, it's such a weird world, and we don't really know what it is that we're doing. You know,
when you say that, and I'm thinking there's one difference I can see with India and what you're saying about the UK, which is I cannot think of a novel that has gone on to do well in India, which did not have publishers hankering for it. You know, something like this, where there are no real takers and you're trying to get it, it seems to me it's just the opposite here, where we just have a real dearth of material that everybody wants. And when somebody writes a novel that is appreciated by 1 or 2 editors, it becomes something that everybody then gets after if they can. And there's hardly any book that hasn't or has had to suffer that fate, which is probably this, you know, because of the number of Sorry?
What about because of the number of?
No, I was thinking that there are perhaps not that many literary novels we get submissions on. Perhaps that's
Right.
why. And not too many writers in India who are, I mean, we all have to fight within a small pool to get the writers. So perhaps that's why it doesn't happen that often. I do know of books that are published in the UK and the US, which have, say, an India or subcontinent setting or subject, and therefore people would automatically think it should have an Indian publisher. But those sometimes may not have them. Partly because I think we just read the same context and setting differently from, say, an editor in the US or UK, and we may not feel our market might take to it. So there are books like that that haven't ended up coming here or have come in as distributed titles, not as published titles. But I'd love to be in your position where a great novel lands on my desk and no one else wants it. And I can just take it.
Also, but what are because the other thing that I found in my career is that often you start with a writer and you think there is amazing talent here, but you know that it will take years for that to happen. And one of those in my life is Kamala Shamsi, who I didn't get through an agent. I was the agent.
Right. Oh, right. That's your agenting time, the 4 years you spent there.
Yes, I met her when she was still a student and I went to a creative writing conference in a college in upstate New York and was given a pile of stories to read. And most of them were really terrible. But there was one shining, beautiful story about a little boy flying a kite on a roof in Pakistan. And I just talked mainly about this story because it was the only one that was, it was just shiningly good. And at the end of it, the girl who'd written it came out and said to me, I think you published my great aunt. And when I was at Virago, I had published in the classic series Asiya Hussain, her 2 books.
Right.
And she was Kamala's great aunt. And it was a most extraordinary thing. And I gave her my card. I was flying back to England and I said, I think there's a longer narrative in here. And if you want to work with me, keep in touch. And it became In the City by the Sea. And I sold it to Granta Books. And that was the beginning of our relationship. And we've worked together ever since. So when I joined Bloomsbury, she came to me. But I often meet authors in strange places, so I've not always been reliant on agents. So another Tishani Doshi, I met at a bed and breakfast. Breakfast at a literary festival, at the Hay and Wine Literary Festival. I've always found literary festivals a brilliant way of meeting authors. So I think I've always thought, even though I was an agent myself, I've always thought it's important as an editor to meet writers outside of the trade. Make connections with people, which is, as I said, literary festivals are wonderful ways of doing that.
Yeah. In fact, talking about In the City by the Sea, I was in Penguin in those days, and I remember the proofs coming there, and eventually we ended up licensing it, I think, for India.
You did. Yes.
Yeah. And at that point, I remember also us saying, but why can't we publish her in India, even later? And I remember Kamala saying to me at some point that, she's so happy with you and with Bloomsbury at that later that there was no need for her to look for another publisher ever. And that's really the heart of this business, isn't it? I mean, isn't it the best thing when you can work with an author and they just don't want to leave you? And whatever comes, whether the shape of your business changes, they still stick. And but that's also the heartbreak of the business, I guess, especially when you're a smaller publisher and people come and get published by you, become famous, and then move on to the next big money, big imprint. Does that happen to you? Has that happened in the past? Have you had your share of heartbreaks as well?
Always. We all have, haven't we? I mean, none of us are without our heartbreaks. Absolutely none of us. But in the early days at Virago, Pat Barker was one. I wasn't the editor, but she started publishing with Virago, and then then Penguin took her, and she became so famous with the Regeneration trilogy. And it's always hard, but also I think there are times when the relationship needs change because things get stuck and an author feels that, you know, somewhere else might be able to bring new energy, and that can be the case as well.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I've had writers come to me from other publishers where, you know, they've needed the change. And for Jhumpa Lahiri was one of those. She was HarperCollins in the UK, and she came to Bloomsbury, and it's, you know, it is possible to do that. So that is part of it. And the only thing is that as you get older, you deal with it better. And when I was younger, you know, I would literally cry if I lost.
I know the feeling. Yeah.
You know.
I think it's the thing that publishing really teaches you as an editor, particularly as part of publishing. I mean, because in the beginning, as you said, you can't breathe. You're so upset with what has happened. And then along the way, you realize that these people are no different, whether they're published by you or they're published by somebody else. What made you friends, what made you like their writing, that's not going to change. So the only way to deal with it is really to be a little bit detached and to say, well, okay, so we don't get to publish this person, but this person remains in my life, and that's more important at one level. And just giving up on them. You know?
Absolutely. And those are wonderful. It's like, just as we went into lockdown, I got a parcel from America, and it was a hat knitted by Donna Tartt with a kind of pom-pom on the top. And I published her second novel and then lost The Goldfinch, and it broke my heart. But, you know, we have the friendship, and that is the most important thing, really.
Correct. Yeah. I think that's the learning, that the sooner you get there in publishing, the better for your sanity and for your judgment on the next book, because you also have to learn when to let go. Yes. And I've seen this about myself, that the day I have a heartbreak like that, the next day I wake up and I write 5 mails to 5 people that I never got around to doing about a new book, because, you know, you didn't get that kick to start something till you've been kicked in the back yourself. And then you get up and you start thinking about, so what can I do next that's exciting, that's going to turn things around for myself, if not, you know, for work. And then you end up doing sometimes better work. So I guess it's all right to lose some and make some new things happen. But while you were in publishing, those years in agenting, did they lead to relationships that shaped, you know, things differently for you? Like, did you then go back into publishing with a different sense of how you should deal with writers, or was it much the same?
It not so much. It's been very close to the writers, and that's been a driving force for me. And one of the reasons why I went into agenting is that's the relationship. It's the relationship. You're not torn between loyalty to your company and loyalty to your author.
Right.
But what it did teach me is how important it is to work with agents, and I hadn't understood that properly before. And how, at its best, it's an incredibly creative collaboration. And you know how if you work together, then you do better by the author and better for the book. And it also taught me how important it is that it's a working relationship. Unfortunately, some agents don't see it as that. They see it as being a relationship of aggression. And that is so unconstructive and uncreative, I think. And it's always really difficult to work. And I think it can harm a book if the relationship is bad. But if the relationship is good, and it does mean that as a publisher, you realize that the agent does need to haul you up occasionally and, you know, demand things of you. And that's actually a good thing. And I love agents who ring you and say, you know, so-and-so is, you know, might be really good to call him or her. You know, I think, I've not been in touch for so long, or, you know, what are your colleagues in this department doing? And you think, I better find out, you know, that it's a very, very good thing. You know, once you've got the deal done, there's all the publishing, and the agent, a really good agent, is part of the publishing as well as the deal.
Right. But you felt happier going back to publishing than being an agent,
I didn't decide to leave agenting at all. I liked it, and it was working for me. I like the freedom, the independence of it, the fact that you could basically do whatever you wanted. It was also terrifying because you know what you're earning to the last penny, the last p. But it was only that Bloomsbury came to me, and Liz Calder, who had been the first editor-in-chief, was thinking about who was going to succeed her, and she asked if I would do that. And I took a long time to think about it. I can't imagine why I took more than 4 minutes, but I took 4 months because I knew that it was going to be the most important decision of my career, which it was. And I couldn't say no to it because Bloomsbury was everything I liked in publishing. It was the dream publisher. It was independent, but it had a good size to it. It was imaginative. It had a fantastic culture. It was eccentric in many ways. And I've seen Bloomsbury over the 30, well, I've been there for 21, nearly 22 of the 34 years that Bloomsbury's been going. And it's changed a great deal, but the heart is still there. And so I just couldn't say no. That was, right. It wasn't wanting to leave behind agency at all.
All right. Okay. So Bloomsbury is one of those that has managed to stay independent, hasn't it?
Yes, but we are a PLC. And that means we're publicly owned.
Limited, right.
And exactly. And so we are, what Nigel always says is we're owned by a lot of pension funds. We're owned, by all these different people in the city. And the thing that makes it very remarkable, one of the many things it does, is that because we're a PLC, we have to be profitable. We have to be, because we have these shareholders and they expect us to perform. And we had the extraordinary luck of a certain book.
Yes, indeed. Of a certain few books.
A certain few books. But when I joined, the only one had been published, the second was just being published, and it was working, and something astonishing was happening in the company. But I was there to see the explosion of it. And I mean, it was unbelievable. It was just unbelievable. And that gave us, it was the greatest gift in the world, but it also was one of the most difficult gifts in the world, because when we got to the end of the series, there was, our golden goose was not laying, every 2 years or whatever. And we had to rethink how we were going to go into the future. And that was a real crisis time for us. And what Bloomsbury did was actually buy, rather like the bigger models of the corporations where they bought up all these smaller publishers. We bought up smaller publishers and extended our base and went into specialist publishing and academic publishing. So we sort of widened our base, because until then we'd been reliant, and better than anyone, the terrors of trade publishing. Because, it's like the film industry. It's so hit and miss. Yeah. But so to create a solid base of specialists and academic publishers really helped us.
And so since we are doing this in India, in Kolkata, virtually, I have to ask you about how different is strategy for a company that has a certain identity, a certain set of writers, a certain way of running a business in, say, the UK, and then having a subsidiary or a branch in another country like you do in India, in Delhi. How does that work? Like, do you, as a parent company, then figure out what is to be done here? Do you leave the Indians to their business with, certain revenue targets or whatever? How does one keep a brand cohesive? I mean, I'm not talking about the specifics of this, but of India or how it runs. But how does this work? Because, of course, we know this is how PRH works and how HarperCollins works. And they're huge, but they're also one kind of beast. So what goes into that?
Yes. It's something that I think takes a long time to work out properly. And Bloomsbury America, Bloomsbury US, started before India. That has been going for 20 years, pretty much, 18, 20 years. And it's a long process. It's not something that I think can be done overnight because publishing is such an organic thing. But the general feeling is that each country should be its own thing, because local publishing is local publishing, and we wouldn't dream of saying to America, we know that you should be doing this kind of book. We like to publish together as much as we can with all our subsidiaries. So where we can share authors, it's a particularly good thing.
Yeah.
But we recognise it's not without its trials that you cannot, one editor can't buy a book for different territories. Because
it's not easy.
It's not easy, no. And there was a period with America where we were trying to buy Wild English on everything. And that was very difficult for the editors, because you couldn't say, A, that you loved a book that you didn't love, or B, that you felt it was right for your market if you didn't think it was right for your market.
Right.
And so it's all taken its time to find its way. But with India, I personally have been involved on what was at the beginning of when it was set up, with the trade side, the sort of literary side, in that I was involved in hiring. So Diyakar Hazra was our first.
Oh, right, of course.
I was very involved in appointing her when we set up Bloomsbury in India, and then also Faiza Khan, who followed her. So when Dia was there, we would talk on the phone every week. We'd Skype. So we had lots of conversations, and I think those conversations are very important. As we were saying earlier before this started, I have been going to Jaipur every year, and I've loved going to India. I go quite a lot to Indian festivals. It's been a very important part of the work that I do, that kind of cross-pollination, I think, is very helpful. But it's all a work in progress, and I don't think there's any straightforward way of.
Alexandra, do you see a difference in the kind of people who get into publishing now and the kind of editorial sales, marketing people, etc.? I remember at some point being rather surprised when I discovered that the publisher of an imprint I can't remember now whether this was Penguin or Harper, one of those days of mine, where the publisher was actually someone who had come in from the marketing department. And there was a whole team of editors reporting to her. And I've seen that happen in various publishing houses over time. Is that something that you think is now going to be the norm? Is that how it is in the UK?
I don't think that there is any norm, but definitely there's been more of that. And I think that is to do with the fact that marketing and sales have become certainly as big a voice in what is acquired and published as the editorial voice. And I think that the larger these groups get, the more that will happen. It's inevitable, I think.
And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's not as though marketing people don't have a sense of what is a good book and what can sell. I mean, of course they do. It was just, I remember at that point, a complete shift in the way one imagined a publishing sort of organization works, or the mind of a person works, etc. But I have a feeling we'll soon run out of time as well. Oh, we have been talking for a while. Okay. So can I ask you one thing before I look at what might be here? Yeah, I think there might be... trying to wrap up soon, they're messaging us. I just want to ask you one thing, which is, you've absolutely lived the best of publishing, seen all the great changes, for the better, I think, many of these changes. But if there was a way in which you would reimagine publishing, or if you could set up a company tomorrow all by yourself with every freedom to decide what would happen in there, and if profit wasn't the biggest motive of all, what would you do? How would you do it?
I would break publishing down back into small units.
Okay.
And
what would you be publishing?
What I would publish, I would just publish books that I love. I mean, I am just so driven by my own taste, and I would love not to ever hear the word "the market" ever again. But you know, that's my fantasy life.
Okay, I'm very sorry to tell you, I don't think this is going to be very easy to achieve. No. But I wish you would, and if you do, please give me a call. I'll come join you wherever I am and find some books of that sort. It just is such an enormous privilege being part of this publishing world and being able to do this thing we love and actually earning a salary for it. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
So yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is, I think we were supposed to talk about what plagues publishing. I have a feeling we just spoke about our love for publishing, and perhaps that was not what we were meant to do. I do apologize to anyone who thought they were going to listen to solutions and problems, but you do have a fantasy at the end of it. So maybe that's all right, and you can take that away. Since we do have to wrap up, I'm just going to say thank you very much, Alexandra. I loved having this conversation with you, unexpected, though its form was. And I hope whoever listens in at whatever point gets something to take away from it. Thank you, Atre. Thank you, Oxford Bookstores. Thank you, the festival. It's been a pleasure talking to Alexandra Pringle. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.